Ladies and gentlemen, please take a seat. We are going to start our conversation very shortly. Thank you. Well, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome and thank you for joining us for a dialogue on renewables and carbon market developments in the context of carbon neutrality. Now, today's conversation is not just important, it's existential, to borrow the term used by President Tokayev in his opening speech today. Indeed, UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres referred to the recent report by IPCC on climate change as a survival guide for humanity. And he recommended an everything, everywhere, all at once approach to climate action. And almost all the high-level guests invited by the President to speak earlier today during the plenary mentioned the urgency of the green transition. And the President of Kyrgyzstan and the Prime Minister of Uzbekistan both highlighted the particular vulnerability of Central Asia to climate change. They also called for further funding of the region's green projects to help them meet their very ambitious renewable targets. Now, undoubtedly, the goal of net zero carbon emissions by 2050 in the region and globally will require a huge and concerted effort to increase renewable energy sources. But it's happening. McKinsey predicts that by 2030, global renewable electricity capacity could almost triple from today's levels. And the International Energy Agency said and recommends that the share of renewable electricity should reach 60% by 2030 to achieve climate targets. So joining me today to discuss the crucial role of renewables and carbon offsetting mechanisms to achieve net zero, please welcome Aida Siddiqova, Director of Energy for Eurasia, Middle East and Africa at the Sustainable Infrastructure Group of EBRD, and please extend the warm welcome I'm going to give her right now by joining me. Thank you very much. We also welcome Mohammed Jamil Aramahi, who is the CEO of Masdar, the UAE clean energy developer and operator, Marco Arcelli, the CEO of Aqua Power, which develops, invests and operates a portfolio of power generation and desalinated water production plants, and Laura Altinger, who's head of Regional Nature, Climate and Energy team at the UNDP Bureau for Europe and Central Asia. Thank you so much for joining us today. Now, Aida Siddiqova, to start with, the EBRD is a major investor in the energy sector globally and certainly a key player here in the region with investments of over 680 million euros. You have also a portfolio here of 5.5 billion euros. So undeniably, EBRD plays a crucial role in the green transition of its member countries. But what if some countries, especially developing economies, derive most of their revenues from hydrocarbons, like Kazakhstan, for instance? What are your plans or recommendations to balance net zero targets with the support for local economies?
Thank you very much, Charlotte. And just to say, it's a great pleasure to be here and share the panel with our clients and partners and see this great turnout. So to your question, we are acutely aware by the climate emergency. We're guided by it. You mentioned the latest IPCC report and how little time the world has. So all our projects as of January this year have to be Paris aligned. And last year we invested 6.4 billion euros in green projects, reaching 50% of green in our portfolio within only 2 years. So our activities are therefore in the energy space are anchored in electrifying economies, basically electrify everything, and decarbonize these energy sources that drive electrification. And it means from Morocco to Mongolia, the region I cover, which this region has one of the most carbon intensive and energy intensive countries, where, to your question, where we think there are binary choices to be made. We have fossil fuel-driven economic growth versus decoupling of the GDP growth from emissions. We have this dilemma of climate change versus energy security and diversification of supplies. Then there's an energy trilemma of, we all know, affordable, secure, and sustainable versus the emerging quadrilemma now here, where an element of realism apparently has to be added. And there's, again, alleged dichotomy between social dimension and decarbonization. So there's just transition, of course, and we at EBRD, we actually don't see these all as mutually exclusive aspects or directions. There's a paradigm shift that is needed and how we approach energy transition. For example, trilemma is no longer, there's no longer a trilemma from my point of view. Renewables can provide an answer to affordable, sustainable, and yet resilient energy source, of course, assuming we address the intermittency and we basically start strengthening the grid. Specifically in this region, it's a very emerging issue. And of course, we are aware that the developed world relied on fossil fuel to drive the economic growth. However, it did come at the expense of emissions, causing human-made global warming, which we see every day. By the way, this is not normal. This level of temperatures for Astana, I grew up in the region, this is not normal for early June. So, we are observing it on a daily basis. So what we have to do is to utilize the main points of leverage that we, EBRD, have in our armory. How would we use it to reduce energy intensity and carbon intensity, and how we enact climate policies? We are very much involved in climate mitigation measures, and this is ranging from energy efficiency in the production, triggering behavioral changes on the demand side. Policies are fundamental in determining what structural changes are required in countries like Kazakhstan and wider Central Asia. And so, at the end of the day, decoupling, because this is what it is all about, decoupling is about political will and a vision. Kazakhstan approved its LTS in February this year. It was the first country to do so in Central Asia. Kazakhstan is also the first regional country that announced its net zero target by 2060. And the role of BRD is just to help support countries like Kazakhstan in it through accelerating decarbonization and delivering resilient, efficient, and inclusive energy systems, addressing the social aspect. So what do? We support renewables at scale with our great partners and clients. We upgrade networks. We try to phase out unabated fossil fuel or switch to less carbon-intensive fossil fuel. In Kazakhstan, it's coal. Predominantly 70% of energy mix is coal. So we financed coal-to-gas switch last year of Almaty CHP. Is an old CHP in the middle of the city that was spewing fumes at great public health cost, and EBRD supported gas in that instance. But overall, we're moving away from fossil fuel as the answer. We look at on a very selective basis when we can do gas, and it has to fit with the low carbon trajectory. It has to avoid or mitigate the carbon lock-in risk. It has to use the best technology available, and it has to make sense. And the earlier it happens, the earlier we get to the peaking of GHG emissions, the better. And this is what we've been guided by. So to finish, the economic growth based on subsidized fossil fuel has cost. It does have its cost. Carbon has its price tag, as we all know, and it's both in the form of a climate change, public health again, but also economic and monetary value. There's a dollar number assigned to it. So CBAM, the carbon border adjustment mechanism, is coming. the countries will have to look at decarbonizing their exports and ensure they remain competitive in a sustainable way. And this is what the BRD is working through a variety of streams and things like carbon markets, helping countries to do that. So at the end of the day, it's all the question of money that is surfacing. So we don't see any binary choices here. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, Mr. Al-Ramahi, Masdar is a company that originates from the UAE, a region that traditionally was very reliant on hydrocarbons. So how did you become a global clean energy company, and what's your strategy to accelerate the deployment of renewables at home and abroad?
Thank you, Charlotte. First, let me say Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and good afternoon to all of you. And on behalf of my team at Masdar, I'm really delighted to be here in Astana in this great event. And just maybe to answer your question, we are an Abu Dhabi-based company. We are called Abu Dhabi Future Energy Company, Masdar, established in 2006, so almost 2 decades ago. And the idea of establishing Masdar was to diversify away from our base, which is a fossil fuel base. All of our power in our country at that time, 2 decades ago, used to be generated through natural gas mainly. And the idea by our leadership was that this is not sustainable. And we, as a country, even though God blessed us with plenty of resources when it comes from fossils, and this resource is not abundant, and therefore we need to look into the future. They established Masdar with a target at that time in 2006 of achieving 7% renewable energy target in our energy mix by 2020. But they did not only establish Masdar, which I represent today. The leadership in our country also believed in peaceful, clean nuclear power generation. And they have also established a company called Emirates Nuclear Power, which will ultimately be a very important component of the future energy mix of our country. Because as we look forward, because we like to look forward, the past is behind us, we have committed to carbon neutrality as a country by 2050. And to achieve that, we know that we need to increase the penetration of clean and renewable energy or electrons into our grid, thus decarbonizing the grid. But we also need to look at other areas to ensure neutrality is achieved. And that's why Masdar today, Charlotte, is not only looking at renewable energy generation from wind and solar, geothermal and hydro, but also Masdar is looking to produce 1 million tons of green hydrogen by 2030. And I think, personally, hydrogen will play a critical role in the carbon neutrality economies of the future. When we assess the hard-to-abate sectors, and these sectors could be such as mining. We are in Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan is also a country like our country, blessed with a lot of resources. In fact, Kazakhstan is blessed in more resources than our country. They have so many minerals here that are essential and in fact critical for our future and for the future of decarbonization and electrification of the world. So how do we look at mining? We need to decarbonize mining. We need to decarbonize transport sector. We need to decarbonize aviation sector. And that's why we believe hydrogen will play an important role in these critical, hard-to-abate sector. So, before I stop, I need to speak about what we are doing here in Kazakhstan, right? Okay. So we have signed with our dear friends here in Kazakhstan essentially an MOU that started the relationship between Masdar and the Kazakh government, represented by the Ministry of Energy, and of course the Kazakh development funds. And this is a 1,000 megawatt of wind project that is phased into two phases. The first phase is 500 megawatt, and the other phase is the other 500 megawatt. But it's also combined with battery storage solution to ensure stability of the grid. So I think this is a very important step for us at Masdar as we come and invest in Kazakhstan. We are very active, obviously, in Central Asia and the south of the Caucasus region. We are active in 40 countries. So we are lucky to be here, and we are happy to be invited and participate in the decarbonized, sustainable future of this great country. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, interestingly, Marco Arcelli, there are many parallels between Masdar and Aqua Power, since you come from Saudi Arabia, that's where the company is based, and you have an expanding presence here in the region in Central Asia. You're currently building one of the world's largest wind farms in Uzbekistan. So based on your experience, what is the best way to incorporate more renewables into the system, and how do you see the role of large renewable projects in helping countries like Kazakhstan achieve carbon neutrality?
Yeah, thank you, Charlotte. I think that in all these panels, in all these conferences, we keep talking about how can we build more renewables around the world. But I think that's not the question. I think that today renewables are not built for ideology, but they're built simply because they're the cheapest, the most secure, and the fastest technology that can be built to supply energy to a grid, to supply electricity to a grid. So building renewables and driving the growth of renewables is easy. As you say, and also Mohammed hinted to that, it's then how do you integrate them in the system? That's the difficult thing, and that's why we're not building yet 100% renewables everywhere. I would like to make a couple of points on this, and also to underline where we are today as Aqua Power. So to us, when we talk about wind and solar, we consider it already an old technology. We're beyond that. What we're doing today is to try really to find how we integrate and how we can push them more. We are the first mover, for instance, now in green hydrogen in the world. We have launched and we have invested today more than 1 billion in NEOM, together with our partners Air Products and NEOM, in Saudi Arabia. This is the first commercial scale project for green ammonia in the world that will target exports to Europe and other markets. Last month in Uzbekistan, we launched the second project. It's going to be in phases, so a first phase for the domestic market and a larger phase later on once everything is in place for export again potentially to the European Union, to Europe. We see this not only as a way to decarbonize then the local economy. Most of the green hydrogen projects today are really produced locally for local consumption. But it's really a way for creating a new commodity, a new trade-in. So it's integration not just in the grid, let me say, but it's an integration in the markets. We believe that this will bring prosperity to regions like Central Asia because it will integrate them more, and the same for North Africa. So all the markets that surround the European Union, surround Europe, we believe that will enjoy higher prosperity because of the development of green hydrogen and green ammonia. So that's the first one. The second consideration is you can use hybrid systems of renewables and other things. We're also the largest private desalinator in the world. I think we brought reverse osmosis to the world, the new technology that everybody's adopting today. We were a precursor in that many years ago. And the recent projects, the last two projects that we built, integrate reverse osmosis and solar panels. So a lot of the internal consumption of the plant is actually satisfied by renewable energy. We're producing effectively green water. That's another way to further build renewables without creating a lot of stress on the grid. And that's, I think, what we're targeting to really provide a solution to greenifying beyond the electricity sector, which is something that was the focus for the last 20 years. The third, of course, when you go and you have exhausted, with today's technology, what you can do is how do you support the grid? And as Mohammed was saying today, there are two ways. One is to incorporate battery storage into your projects. That's what we are doing increasingly. The other is actually to continue to think about the system as a system. It's good to have a project, a wind project or a solar project that can, let me say, self-sustain itself along the day or for more hours during the day. We are one of the biggest developer, owner, and operator of concentrated solar power. We are integrating battery storage in our plants. But gas is still not over. I think that gas will still be here for the next 20 years. And when you think about loading and balancing a system, you have to look at the system in total. So we accompany, and in fact in Uzbekistan, we're building 1,500 megawatt combined cycle because that is part of the energy solution that the country has developed to ensure safe, sustainable, and affordable electricity for the population. So those are the two main things. Then we go beyond that. And beyond that, I think that where we need to work more closely with governments, with the local TSOs, with the local utilities is on the grid. Some countries where there is a large penetration of renewable energy, we see curtailments that are as high as 20%. That is a waste. It's a waste either for the investor or it's a waste for the country, depending on who sustains the burden, let me say, of the curtailed energy. So whenever we go to a country now, we try to work with them to work together and say, where do the investments in grids need to be done and how do you complement the grid so that you don't end up in a situation with curtailment. So this is, I think, the recipe that we're trying to put in place with our partners, with the local host, for increasing the penetration and maximizing the ability for these countries to engage with the rest of the world, either through commodities or in general a better local development of the economies and then exporting the goods. The last point that I would like to make is about the energy trilemma. So I think that rather than a trilemma, is a quadrilemma because we talk about sustainability, we talk about affordability, we talk about security, but all that does not really have sense unless you focus also on speed. And speed is, I think, in our experience, what has really resulted in the success of some countries over the others in the ability to create an environment that between different agreements and different type of approach ensure that there is a quick rollout of all the technologies.
Thank you very much. Time is definitely not on our side, for sure. So, Laura Altinger, thank you very much for joining us today. Now, from UNDP's perspective, to which extent renewables can solve the current energy quadrilemma? I think everyone here is pretty convinced that renewables are the way to go when it comes to reaching climate targets, but how can they specifically address those problems or challenges?
Well, thank you very much. I'm very honored to be here today. I think that the European example is a very good one to show how the renewable capacity has actually been the response to the energy crisis. So we've seen in Europe the gas and coal prices rising by 60% at the back of the tail end of the pandemic. And at the same time, geopolitical tensions have caused prices to further increase another 40% in 2022 due to the gas supply restrictions. So Europe has managed to push the renewables as a response to this crisis. And this has helped to mitigate the burden of the energy cost to the consumers, so to really address the issue of affordability. Now, renewable energy capacity in 2023 and 24 have by far exceeded the projections of the IEA by 40%. Most countries in Europe have introduced policies as well to address the slow and complex permitting procedures for the renewable energy projects. And this has saved consumers 100 billion euros over the period 2021 to 23, as was estimated by the IEA. So overall, we're seeing, even at the global level, this additional capacity on renewables coming in. In China, it accounted almost to half of renewable power capacity worldwide in 2022. And in India, it's also been increasing and expected to increase in the next 2 years due to faster onshore wind and hydropower and distributed solar PV. So in Kazakhstan, they also have made very ambitious targets, set the GHG emissions targets through their NDC and the new strategies on green economy, and the potential for scale-up of the renewables is huge. But of course, the country's dependence on the large reserves of coal, which are inexpensive and don't reflect the externalities that coal produces on the environment, is making this quite a challenging task. So the first barrier in Kazakhstan is the price of energy. Although it's not directly subsidized, the prices are being kept artificially low by regulatory measures and administrative measures. So, for example, the tariffs for power producers don't reflect the maintenance costs or the replacement costs or these environmental externalities. The second, turning now to the financing, the renewables financing isn't on track for us to achieve our targets, our global climate targets of 1.5 degrees. And as a result, much more needs to be done on this financing track as well. So lessons from what we see in different countries in order to scale up renewables would be first, the government auction designs need to be made more taking into account inflation, the interest rate rises, and the turbulence in the commodity prices to be attractive to investors. For example, in Europe in 2022, 1/6 of the renewable energy auction volumes were unallocated. Secondly, we see that the rapid expansion of wind and solar needs to be accompanied by policies that support the grid infrastructure, as Marco has said. And an increasing amount of electricity generation from wind and solar is being curtailed in many markets where the grid infrastructure isn't in place and can't handle the additional distributed solar PV. Third, developing de-risking instruments and credit enhancements is very important for the financing. There are still many constraints to the financing, and this can be solved through blended finance, using concessional financing to blend and to leverage additional private sector money, institutional investors, and so on, through these blended instruments. And finally, it's very important to have a broader policy environment which supports the renewable uptake. For example, in Kazakhstan, this would mean policy measures to reduce the emissions not covered by the emissions trading system, such as in the transport and residential sectors. And in those sectors covered by the ETS, it would mean also to help to prop up those carbon prices. Currently, they're very low. The average secondary market price is around $1, and this is far too low to enable the significant investments that are needed on the renewables. It's also important to get the monitoring, reporting, and verification system in place. And this is important in terms of creating a robust framework for the emissions trading. And transparency also of the data will be particularly important here. Finally, in the Kazakh case, it's a small emissions trading system, and it will be important to link up with other international emissions trading systems to make the market bigger, to be able to scale up those cost efficiencies that arise in a bigger market, a bigger emissions trading market. And we should also keep in mind that this energy transition entails a lot of social benefits. For example, job creation. Renewable energies are creating new jobs in manufacturing, installation, and the maintenance of renewable energy infrastructure. The renewable energy sector employed 12 million people worldwide in last year, and up from 7.2 in 2012. This represents a 67% increase in employment in just one decade. And in fact, the estimates show that up to 65 million net new jobs can be created from the renewable energy space. We at UNDP support the policy environment, the enabling policy environment. We help countries to leverage the additional financing. In Europe and the CIS, we have an active climate finance portfolio of around $500 million US with a pipeline. And these projects help to improve the regulatory environment for renewables and energy efficiency, and to also stimulate these integrated solutions that Marco has talked about. We also work on the de-risking of the renewable energy and on the supporting the green energy for the SMEs. Finally, through our Sustainable Energy Hub, we help to reform fossil fuel subsidies and to introduce carbon pricing. And we're also helping the governments to issue green and sustainability bonds. For example, in Uzbekistan, with our support, it became the first country in this sub-region to issue a sovereign SDG bond 2 years ago, and that was 235 million. So overall, there are a lot of different measures that need to take place in order to scale up the renewable energy.
Thank you very much, Laura. Great to, yes, I think this deserves a round of applause, because it's great to hear you talk about the benefits in terms of social development of the green transition, because quite often we talk about the cost of it and the need for a fair transition, but more on that a little bit later. Now, Ida, EBRD is currently the largest investor to build Kazakhstan's renewable energy plants. I'd like to make you react to what President Tokayev mentioned in his speech this morning, his ambition for the country and the region to become an energy hub. How do we get there?
Well, it's an excellent question, because the potential is huge in Kazakhstan and in broader Central Asia. Maybe I'll start with three numbers. EBRD financed 3.7 gigawatts of renewables in Central Asia overall. That's not a mean feat. Investing over $1 billion US, which is just our financing. And of course, we are using the multiplier effect of how much we mobilized on top of that. And the third number is it's avoided emissions. It's 14 million tons of CO2 emissions per year, which is also very helpful to the decarbonization targets for each specific country. In the region, we see two sort of countries that are doing renewables at scale, who are very much advanced. It's Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. They're offering different models. We have the so-called Uzbek model, where there's several large developers competing for equally large-scale projects. On the other hand, we have Kazakh model, where there's emphasis on smaller, sort of medium-sized capacities, but still with impressive aggregate results. So renewables are getting traction in the region. And of course, we have Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, hydro-rich countries, who are also coming to diversify into non-hydro renewables, which we're very, very pleased to see. Back to Kazakhstan, where we started our activities more than 9 years ago. And we see significant progress achieved since then. 100, I'm just looking at numbers, 130 renewable energy producers with an installed capacity of almost 3 gigawatt and approaching, with under construction, 5% of renewables in the electricity mix. So this is clearly a commitment by Kazakhstan to take its decarbonization seriously. As of last week, there was news, of course, that many are aware of Ministry of Energy announcing 6.77 gigawatt plan for the next 5 years up until 2027 of renewables, of renewable auctions that will be split into annual targets for developers to come and bid. And I think it's a great breakthrough because we will have visibility. Investors will see how much they should plan. It provides a lot of clarity, and another beautiful thing, it's a very close by interim measure, so we're not talking 2035, 2040, 2060, it's now. So for the next 5 years, Kazakhstan will be rolling out 6.77 gigawatt of renewable auctions. Of course, it might well exceed the 15% share target by 2030, but this would be all great. One aspect that's been touched on by the previous speakers that I'd like to bring up again is, of course, the grids, the capacity of grids to absorb all these new renewables. We think that the grids do require sort of a systematic approach and involvement of all market participants. Ultimately, of course, these are national operators, it's the sort of sovereign decision, but the market stakeholders have to be consulted and discussed with. There is an issue, of course, of technical nature. There are there's interconnections. There's cross-border trade potential that is still, we think, underdeveloped and has to be used up more for complementarity between different energy mixes in different countries because we have two hydro-rich countries. But overall, things will have to start moving. We believe with this 6.7 gigawatt coming online, both in Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan, but also Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan will have an important role to play. The parallel investments on the demand side might be required. So it's smart grids, it's digitalization of grid infrastructure, and this would allow to ensure traceability, manageability, and availability of the power grid. And this is something that the recent year, or maybe 2 years, showed that it could be a vulnerability in the region, specifically in both Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. And finally, to say that, of course, we believe that the energy transformation should be driven and will be driven by the private sector. There is a very important role for the governments to play. And they are in charge of creating the enabling environment for renewable investors. This is why we are very grateful to the Ministry of Energy here for the work that they've been all doing with taking into consideration feedback from the market participants, optimizing, improving the regulatory setup year on year, and attracting investments. The latest was the amendment which Kazakhstan adopted last year on allowing auction participants indexation of the tariffs, which is, again, it's a very unique structure to any other country, but it is helpful and it should attract more of renewable investments into the country, which we are hoping for. Thank you.
So I guess the answer is yes. Thank you very much. So I'd like to hear from the CEOs of Aqua Power and Mazda on this. What are your own plans here? And do you agree with President Tokayev that the region and the country have what it takes to become renewable energy hubs? Starting with Aqua Power, maybe, because I understand you've recently agreed to a new development potentially here.
Yes. We signed an agreement that we are now following up on and developing for 1 gigawatt of capacity, renewable capacity here in the country. I think that is for us a starting point. If I have to make a benchmark, we're developing 5.5 in Uzbekistan, and I don't see why Kazakhstan should be second in the region for us. So I really think that this area has all the resources, the potential to really grow big and become a hub We know that a lot of the turbines and the panels today come from China. My point is, why should they continue to come from China? Why don't you make them here? And I think that, you know, as part of that, our experience is, and I go back to maybe the title of the whole conference, that is Tackling Challenges Through Dialogue. In our experience, you know, the most successful countries bring together, you know, a big, clear vision with certain clear milestones, a dialogue with investors so that you know how to speed up things, and then taking decision and executing. Once you have all that, you can take all the other ancillary decisions as an investor to grow beyond, to grow the country beyond the project. And I will bring you my personal experience at Aqua Power. You know, when Saudi embarked into something like this years ago, and I can mention it for various technologies, from water to solar to wind, a lot of the companies that we were using started to follow us in the country and started to manufacture locally. Once you have that volume, it is much, much, much more efficient to simply do it here. And that elevates the country, elevates the industry in the country. But you need to have a plan, and you need to give investors as much as possible visibility about the total volume that can be captured in the country. That is why I'm strongly in favor of systems, and I think that more or less Kazakhstan is in that direction, like other Central Asian countries, to have dual track of negotiations and tenders. The negotiation allows you really to achieve speed. You don't have to prepare tenders, you don't have to prepare anything. You select the strong players in the industry, and you invite them to partner together with a price discovery mechanism that ensures that everything is done, you know, at the right terms. And then in parallel, you have tenders. But I think that the important thing is that, and we heard it today from Ms. Georgieva, interest rates are high for longer, inflation is here, logistical pressure, so prices are increasing, have increased. The IEA published a study that, you know, today we're seeing the highest cost of renewable energy in the past few years. So you need to be quick in doing this before the situation becomes, you know, potentially even more difficult, you know, with smaller players that will be, as it often happens, you know, kind of exiting the market, and then you have to really rely on the stronger players. So it's this combination of aspects that I think can make Kazakhstan very successful. We see now, as you mentioned, Aida, you know, a plan to basically roll out tenders, but there's still these negotiated deals that are going ahead. So I really think that what we're going to see here in the country is an uptick of activity with the potential to develop local manufacturing. The last point I would like to make about the local contribution that we can do, and we did it both in Saudi Arabia with the High Institute for Water and Power Technologies, and in Uzbekistan with Shirin College. Once you know that you're going to invest 5, 10, 15 billion in a country, you become part of the country. You own the problem of saying, how am I going to develop the leadership of tomorrow, the operators of tomorrow in the country? And then you can start, as we have done in Saudi Arabia and Uzbekistan, fund, support schools that will, and programs that will create the people, that will develop the people that you will need. And I think that that is one of the biggest wealth that we can leave with the country beyond the energy.
Thank you very much. Now, Mr. Aramahi, I understand that Masdar has an agreement with the government of Kazakhstan for the construction of a new wind plant here. Could you tell us more and your plans to expand your presence here in the country and beyond?
Yeah, thank you. Well, I mentioned, I guess, in the intro that we've signed an agreement similar to our friends from Aqua with the Ministry of Energy and the Kazakh investment development companies to develop 1 gigawatt of wind and storage capacity into 2 phases. But I think to your point on this region and our view about this region, so whatever the President noted in the beginning and whatever the Prime Minister or President of Kyrgyzstan has highlighted also today, we believe in this. We not only believe in this, we actually took action and moved into this region in the belief that integration within this region is critical. And that's why we are very active, of course, in Uzbekistan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, as well as here in Kazakhstan. So we believe in this story. And we see the future that these governments see. And we did not just sign and inked papers. We are institution designed and built by action. What does that mean? It means that a vision needs to be transformed into reality. And our reality is building clean, renewable projects. The first project for us was inaugurated last year in Uzbekistan. 1 gigawatt of projects in Uzbekistan will be also commissioned and inaugurated by the end of this year. And hopefully when we see each other in a couple of years here, we will inaugurate our project in Kazakhstan. So this is the story for Masdar here in this region. But to make this happen, you require, of course, the vision, the policy, but of course, everybody mentioned this, and I always mention this, the criticality of interconnection and the grid stability is key. So we also need to think about how we can ensure that we build a system that functions properly. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, during the second half of this dialogue, discussion, we'll talk about carbon markets. But before we do, Laura, I just wanted to go back to the concept of the just transition. How do we balance the needs of hydrocarbon-reliant economies with the need to transform and to switch to green technologies and renewables?
Well, I'm very glad for this question in this audience, and I think the energy transition to get our world back on track and avoid dangerous climate change is a very complex undertaking, and it's going to have huge economic and social impacts. Now, supporting the citizens that are most impacted by the green transition is what's at the heart of the concept of just transition. And I think we're realizing that the economic model that we've had so far has had some negative implications as well. For example, the reliance on fossil fuel has caused serious public health risks from the local air pollution, and here in Central Asia, it's particularly bad. In December 2022 in Bishkek, Bishkek topped the IQ Air website's ranking for the cities with the worst air quality. And the average readings of the airborne particulate matters were in the 201 to 300 range, which is deemed very unhealthy. Almaty posts similar numbers. Astana and Tashkent have also featured regularly amongst the top 20 most polluted cities in the world. And this comes about mainly from the coal-powered plants and the stoves in residential homes in Central Asia's largest cities, as well as the aging vehicles on the roads. So there's been a greater realization of these negative impacts and what we need to do to counter those. And also we see in the EU the carbon pricing has generated substantial fiscal revenues, and those fiscal revenues are getting more and more substantial, and they're being recycled into support for coal regions for the just transition. So the EU is quite a prominent model for the just transition. And they've, for example, formulated the European Green Deal, which is a kind of a package of measures on investments, it's innovation, and it's also regulatory measures. And it really aims to support the just transition and to provide those regions most affected by this phase out of coal and those people affected by the phase out, with money and innovation and jobs and reskilling opportunities for the new green sectors. So I think it's a very potent example that's been used. Now, the EU has also put in place a just transition mechanism. And this one consists of 3 pillars. It's the Just Transition Fund, the Invest EU program, and a public sector loan facility. And this, the Just Transition Fund is, for example, a financial instrument of 17.5 billion euros. So these are very big investments that are aimed to the regions and the communities most affected by the transition to a low-carbon economy, to ensure that nobody's left behind. There's another element to the just transition, and that's the social dialogue. We need to bring together all these stakeholders that are affected, the social partners, bring them into the decision-making and help together to design and implement these new policies that help those communities that are most affected. And then there's also reskilling and upskilling, which is very important in order to thrive in the green economy. You also mentioned it. I think it's a very important point. We need to help to create the educational institutions and the skilling opportunities that come about for the green transition. So overall, UNDP also supports countries on the just transition. In Turkey, where I'm based, we had some modeling where we looked at the social and employment impacts of a green economy, and we used the green jobs assessment model together with the ILO to establish those. We're also currently working in the Balkans, the Western Balkans countries, on a just transition concept. And again, this will include a sort of social stakeholder consultation. It will include a support to the green SMEs and support to data and indicators for costing that just transition. So thank you for that question.
Thank you very much, Laura. Now, carbon markets. Why? Because to achieve net zero, we're going to look at extracting carbon out of the atmosphere. And going back to the IPCC report, it's warned that the world will need to extract billions of tons of carbon a year from the atmosphere by the middle of the century to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees. So what's the opportunity there? Also knowing that the market for carbon offsets is estimated to be about $2 billion today, and by the middle of the century, it could grow up to, wait, $624 billion US annually. Okay, that's according to Bloomberg NEF. So Ida, to start with, carbon markets, renewables as offsets, how much of a focus is it at EBRD currently?
Thank you. It is a big focus for us. As I mentioned before, carbon has a price, and the earlier this region embraces this notion and incorporates it into the decision-making and planning, the better, of course. Including, for example, decisions on building or looking in new coal capacity and for the next 40 years, and what sort of cost implications will be in terms of climate, in terms of public health, in terms of economic and social costs. EBRD is an MDB with a very strong private sector mandate. So, and we see therefore carbon markets as a key driver in providing cost-effective decarbonization. While we see, and Laura mentioned that, a huge pickup in developing world on the regulated carbon markets, they're still very nascent in the so-called global south. And we think that the voluntary or offsetting market can play this interim phase in transition into a more robust sort of regulated system. Kazakhstan is actually one of the few, as was mentioned, few developing economies where there is a regulated market. We have an emissions trading scheme launched, I think, in 2013. And actually, Kaz at ETS, already we have a project going years back where we managed to support successfully registration of one of the first domestic offset. It was a Yermintau wind project, very clear and probably more incentivized, because it will be something that will provide impetus for scale up or further scale up of renewables. It will give the right price signals. Again, 2026 is coming, so there has to be behavioral change and understanding and the whole shift in the mentality of carbon-heavy price. And the emissions trading scheme will have an important role to play here. Of course, private sector mobilization will be important again for participation in the ETS scheme, on the financing renewables. We need more active developers who would be embracing it, and I believe the Central Asia system as a whole can provide a useful contribution to the overall carbon markets development.
Thank you very much. And Laura, I believe you've got an interesting case study to share with us. It's carbon, in fact, the very first international carbon project between Switzerland and Ghana. So what can you tell us?
Yes, well, this is the basis of this project is Article 6.2 of the Paris Agreement, and that one basically allows for these ITMOs, so-called ITMOs, internationally transferred mitigation outcomes, to take place. And these are voluntary. It's a voluntary mechanism, and it's basically there to also foster the sustainable development of the host country. So one of the examples, it's correct, I mean, we had the first one, it was between Switzerland and Ghana. And what happened was Switzerland provided financial and technical assistance to Ghana to help implement the adoption of climate-smart agricultural practices. In this particular case, it was the AWD, the alternate wet, dry rice production, and this saves on methane emissions. Now, apart from the emissions saving, and this, transition away from the traditional flooding practices, which is why it saves on methane emissions. It also helps to improve water efficiency without sacrificing the rice yields. So this was a very effective measure, and it helped also the poor rice farmers to transition away to basically boost their income sources and so on. And so this program could be registered as an ITMO, and then by reducing the emissions, it was then transferred to Switzerland, and Switzerland was able to count it as part of its emissions reductions pledge under its nationally determined contribution under the Paris Agreement. So it helped both Switzerland and Ghana, and we see a lot of potential for these ITMOs, but for that we need also to have a very good monitoring, reporting and verification system in place to ensure that the ton of carbon is really a ton of carbon saved, so that it can then be counted for these targets that need to be achieved.
Thank you. Very quick one, Laura. I hear that the United Nations is currently looking at defining carbon markets globally, with a draft circulating at the moment that aims to define a new global carbon market. What can you tell us about this? Any insider information?
Well, I think we're seeing the internationalization of the carbon markets through measures like the CBAM that we heard about from IDA. Because once you bring up a border adjustment mechanism, it incentivizes all the countries that export into the EU to actually start looking at their own carbon pricing mechanisms and to sort of put in place more carbon pricing. So we're seeing an internationalization of that carbon price. So I think that's the way it's going. Even in the US, in the past years, there have been proposals that have been debated on putting together similar measures at the border. So it looks like we're all heading in that direction, and hopefully this can be formalized in the climate negotiations moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, Marco Arcelli, I hear Aqua Power is planning to contribute to the voluntary carbon market. So what are your plans for developing offset trading, and what offset projects have you already implemented, or are you about to?
For this, I need to step back 1 second. And I come from Europe originally, and we've seen the evolution of the carbon markets in Europe that I think today are the most advanced and more sophisticated in the world. At the same time, being the most advanced and most sophisticated, last year we had this beautiful moment where we put a carbon price that was highly driven by political reason to reach 100 euros per ton, at a time when there were disruptions in the market, and so you had power prices that skyrocketed, with renewable energy producers that were making a ton of money, and then the regulator or the fiscal authority or the local government coming in and saying, I'm going to tax these extra profits. So basically, you're putting a measure basically to increase artificially the price of electricity to promote renewables, and then when the renewables make more money, you tax the renewables. So that I would like to make it explicit because it is very complex to design a policy in these markets that are emerging, let me say. And I think one of the reasons of the failure there, besides of disruption, of course, of Ukraine, Russia, is the mandatory element and the political will in a very advanced economy that can sustain the cost of it. So I think that the first point that we need to make is that every market is different, and every market must find a solution that is useful and appropriate for the local conditions. So what we see and what we think could be a great way to develop these markets in developing economies like this region is systems like the one that PIF, the Saudi fund, is putting in place. It's a regional voluntary carbon market, and basically they are expanding participation in this market. And I think the idea and the goal would be to integrate different markets at regional level, because once you put these voluntary markets that I think are the best solutions for developing economy, because they're more traded, they're easier to get these, let me say, price signal without necessarily influencing the final price of electricity. So what you need still is a lot of liquidity. And so what is being worked there is to merge, incentivize companies, and I encourage everybody to participate in the market who is playing in the industry, and then through that basically create this pool that can become actually an interesting way to balance the risk and reward of investing in power projects. So the first one is what type of market. I think that for developing economies, a system like the one that PIF is putting in place, and last year we already made some trades on that platform. That is the first point. The second point is who owns the green certificates when you develop a project. And I'm a firm believer of markets and private participation. So the governments, the regulator, the local host needs to put in place the rules. The attributes are best kept by the private players to kind of balance the risk and reward of the project, and to find together with other private players and with these markets that are being created, the most efficient way to develop this market.
Thank you very much. What about Masdar? Do you see opportunity in the carbon market space?
The beauty of Masdar is that we've been in the business of renewables and clean technologies for 20 years almost. So we have seen it all. So in 2000, almost 16 years ago, we used to have a carbon desk at Masdar. I still remember that. We don't have it anymore, but we still believe in the carbon market, and we still believe that it is very important and critical to accelerate the growth of renewables. However, I mean, I share all the views with my colleagues. I mean, it's fragmented, right? It's complicated. There are a lot of great initiatives that we see, like the PIF initiative, I think. Also in the UAE, we see a few initiatives led by EWIC, for example, Emirates Water and Electricity Company with the Green Certificate Program. At ADGM, there are few initiatives related to carbon markets. There is a massive potential. I believe that Europe is leading the way on the carbon market, of course. But still, there is so much work to be done. And we have, special matter experts that register project. In fact, my first visit, just a story before we close. I'm a storyteller, as you can see. I'm not as smart as my colleagues here, you know. My first visit to this region was for a carbon project in Uzbekistan, in Fergana Valley, CDM project that we have registered to fix gas leaks in the gas pipeline. That was almost 15 years ago. And this project was registered, and in fact, that project generated carbon credits. We gave those carbon credits back to the government because we decided to exit that business. But so it's something that we believe in, and it's something that you will see more in the future.
Well, you are a very smart man because people tend to remember stories more than facts. We have about 10 minutes for questions from the audience. You have been very attentive, and I'm sure you have many for our wonderful panel. Now is the time. Any questions from the audience? Well, if not, I cannot resist the temptation with the UAE here present in our panel to ask you about COP28. Okay, what would success at COP28 look like? In fact, Laura, looking at you right now, it looks like you would like to answer that question.
Well, I think, the panel has made clear that, of course, we need to progress in our ambitions for the climate. So COP28, I mean, there's also the opportunities for the gas and oil companies to make their contribution in terms of their net zero strategies and to perhaps tackle some of those gas leaks through the methane pledge that you mentioned, Mohammed. So there are ample opportunities. There's the issue of the loss and damage fund, to put in place the financing for those countries that are most affected by the losses from climate catastrophic events, and the damages to assets and so on through flooding and these kinds of things. So that's another issue that could make the success. And there's the global stocktake, of course, which is to raise the ambition of the mitigation pledges. So I think, we want to see more ambition from everybody to do their bit. And there's the civil society is tracking countries' ambitions, and there's like the carbon action tracker, which looks at the policies that are being put in place and what the real action on the ground is, not just what countries are saying and the strategies that they're formulating. So I think there's a lot of work to do at COP28. Thank you.
Anyone else on COP28? Mr. Al-Ramahi, given that your home country is hosting COP28, your thoughts?
Country, yes. First, we will look forward for the world to come and join us in the United Arab Emirates and in Dubai. So I think that's the most important thing. We are a great host, by the way. So I'm sure that you will enjoy being in our region and in our country. At Masdar, of course, we are committed from our side to deploy and to invest more in renewable energy. My chairman, of course, Dr. Sultan Al-Jaber, happens to also be the COP28 designate president. I can tell you that he doesn't sleep. He works very, very hard, traveling the world, meeting with all the stakeholders, and hopefully, with consensus, the world will come to Dubai in an inclusive and effective way, trying to demonstrate that we can do it. We can do it. We can achieve what we have signed in Paris, even though what it seems like we are still behind, I would say a little bit, but we are all optimistic. And I think Dubai and Dr. Sultan, under his presidency, hopefully he can and he will be able to bring the world together. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And to finish, hopefully on another high note, Ida, with all the support of EBRD, can we reach climate targets and the road to net zero?
Well, as President Tokayev said today at the plenary, we need to sort of unite in the action. Biz birgimiz in Kazakh, so it's all hands on deck situation. Hopefully COP in Dubai will show that, and we really, we're past the stage where it's climate doom incantations and how it's horrible, and we're now into the action territory. And it's great to see that this panel today was all about projects, about action, about policy actions. And I just wish it continues. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I think we'll leave it there. I'm sure you'll all agree that it was a very rich discussion and panel. Thank you so much for your participation. Thank you. And see you at COP, of course. Thank you.